Here's the second video installment on the Founding Fathers or the history of psychology. I ran out of battery at the end of the first video for this history section, so I apologize for the abrupt and strange ending. The point I was trying to make as I was fumbling with my dying battery with my video recorder, Aristotle was more of a scientist than Plato or Socrates. He was the first that we know of to pronounce that people are born with a blank slate. This is known as tabula rasa. This is Greek for blank slate. Essentially what Plato is saying, essentially what Aristotle is saying is that it's more the environment and not biology that's going to influence how you turn out. He says that your life is like a blank slate or a blank or empty chalkboard, and that the experience of life will be the chalk or the ink that fills up that board. You're going to have people later in the early 1900s, like John Watson, for example. You don't have to know this yet. He was a behaviorist, a psychologist, who said essentially he could take any human being and put him or her in a specific physical environment or social environment and have them turn out the way that he wanted to, just based on manipulating the environment. So he's the first to say that it's really experience that makes you what you are, more than biology or genetics. And then, of course, we have a random cute pet picture, like we always do. You don't need to know any of that. Just throwing that at you. It would be easy to spend hours talking about different people throughout history who have influenced psychology. I don't want to do that. I'm trying to select some of the more important people with some of the more important ideas. And we're going to move ahead. We're going to get away from ancient Greece, and we're going to move to the 15 and the 1600s. René Descartes was a British mathematician and philosopher. Lived from 1596 to 1650. You may not know Descartes, or you may have never heard of Descartes, but you've probably heard his famous quote, "I think, therefore I am." He believed in empiricism, and this is the important thing for your notes, this asterisk point at the bottom. He believed in empiricism, which is a philosophy stressing that the only way of obtaining true knowledge is through the senses. We talk about empirical data. We talk about being able to see something and measure it objectively. And his idea of empiricism is very important for psychology even today. We don't deal with conjecture or guessing or the supernatural. We actually deal with what we can see and measure. So that's very important. He was also what's called a dualist. He thought that the mind and the body were two different things, and that the body could affect the mind, and also that the mind could affect the body. Charles Darwin, the next person that I want to talk to you about. A British scientist, certainly you've heard of Darwin, you've probably studied him in biology or other science classes. Lived from 1809 to 1882. He was a natural scientist. You've probably heard of the Voyage of the Beagle. His ideas of natural selection and survival of the fittest are important here. I'll go back to that slide. He was doing his work with plants and animals, not with human beings. And his idea of natural selection brought with it the idea that the strongest traits in an organism will survive and be passed on to the next generation, and so forth, and so forth. The strongest traits ensure survival, which speaks to the adaptability of an organism, whether it's a plant or an animal, to its physical environment. And also survival of the fittest. Essentially, those plants or animals, organisms with the characteristics most adaptable to their environment will survive. So the strongest will make it and the weakest will die off. Well, that's all good and well, and certainly it does make a lot of sense with plants and with animals. However, people like Herbert Spencer, who was a British philosopher, lived from 1820 to 1903, came along and applied, or rather misapplied, Darwin's ideas to human beings. Spencer thought, this stuff about natural selection and survival of the fittest also can be applied to human beings. And you got to remember, Spencer is alive during a time where population growth is exploding, and you have real problems with overpopulation. And in the wake of this, we're still trying to feed the poor. We're trying to help people who need assistance. And Spencer said, well, wait a minute, why are we helping the weakest links in the chain, if you will? So Spencer came along and said, and others like him came along and said, the weakest need to die off anyway, whether it's in terms of intelligence, physical strength, mental disability, however we're going to define weak. By natural selection, those traits will weed themselves out, and the weak will die off, ensuring a stronger, more fit human race. So he would actually go to churches and urge church officials, preachers, congregation members not to help the needy, not to feed the hungry, because we're weakening the human race. Let the poor weed themselves out, according to Spencer. Doesn't sound like very nice stuff at all. Now, Gall and Spurzheim, these are the next people that we'll talk about. They were phrenologists. They came up with this idea of mapping the skull, if you will. Now, they were German, and they were essentially charging the rich and the well-to-do women in Germany an exorbitant fee to sit down and to basically have this reading done. Their idea was that certain parts of the skull, if you had like a bump, and you can feel around on your own skull, parts of your head, you have bumps, and in other parts you have little indentations or grooves, if you will. So some parts stick up a little bit, other parts you might have a little groove. So what they're going to say is that if you have a bump, let's say, I'm just going to randomly pick here on this area of the brain that says cautiousness. If you have a bump right there, that means that you have an abundance of or too much. So you would be overly cautious. Okay, I'm going to pick another one just randomly here. Let's say up here, number 16, hope. If you have a dent or a groove there, then you would lack hope. So you would not be a very hopeful person. Now, you don't have to memorize this map of the brain, but you get the idea of what they're doing. Now, they called phrenology, or defined phrenology, as science of the brain. There's really no science to it, and we know that this is not true. They've been accused of being frauds, perhaps even creepers, because they were charging money to feel around on the heads of these women in Germany. We don't know that for sure. But here's what we do know. We do know that by accident, they stumbled upon a very important concept called localization of function, and you're going to want to jot that down in your notes. That's their contribution. What does that mean? Well, localization of function simply means this: certain parts of the brain control certain parts of our functioning. Again, localization of function, certain parts of our brain control certain parts of our functioning. Now, they had it wrong up here. This is not how it works, but their idea is correct. We know now that certain parts of our brain do serve specific functions. There's a part of the brain that's responsible for speech. There's a part of the brain that's responsible for memory. There's a part of the brain that's responsible for discerning between what is real and what is fantasy. Motor coordination, on and on and on and on. And then we get to probably the most famous case study in all of psychology, and this guy is definitely mentioned in your textbook. A guy by the name of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a railroad worker from Vermont, and he suffered a terrible accident. He was working, and there was an explosion, and a steel rod actually, I'm going to show you a picture of it. Hopefully I've got it on here. A steel rod entered through the bottom of his right eye and exited through the top of his skull. And he lived. That's the amazing part. He didn't die. And this is during a time where medical technology certainly is not what it is today. So, he lives. So what happens? And why is this an important story to tell? Well, again, just like with Gall and Spurzheim, the important contribution here of his story is localization of function. We start to see for the first time that maybe certain parts of the brain really do control certain things because his personality was altered. He actually traveled in a circus for a while. He lived, I think, something like 10 to 12 years after the accident. But very specific things changed. His personality changed. Certainly his vision. He wasn't able to see in one eye because the optic nerve was severed during the explosion. He was very easygoing, likable, and now after the accident he's very angry. He's angered very easily. He's described as being cranky. He's impatient. So we start to see that the brain really does have a big impact on how we function. And of course we end with one more random cute pet picture. So hopefully you have good notes on this stuff. Again, I tried to condense the history stuff for you and make it as interesting as possible. We'll call that the end of this part. Thank you.